I didn't do this on purpose. I was actually just kind of looking at it in passing on the way up here. But really what the two boxes have done for us, with the exception of, I guess, verse 9 and 10, it has shown us the parallel that Peter writes with. And we'll talk more about that here in just a moment. Now, as we said last week, verse 4 through verse 10 is one sentence in Greek. Now, we have semicolons there to kind of stop a thought and start another one, but a semicolon in English and in Greek never stops a sentence. Only a period stops a sentence. And so we have one sentence here. And so for contextual purposes as we read, I'd like to read verses 4 through 10 again. And then when we go back, we'll talk just briefly about verses 4 and 5 and then go to verses 6 through 10. For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, and if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example to those who would live ungodly lives thereafter, and if he rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men, for by what he saw and heard that righteous man, while living among them, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day by their lawless deeds, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge in the flesh in its corrupt desires and despise authority. Now there at verse 10 is one of our characteristics of these Gnostic teachers, of these antinomial or against the name of Jesus Gnostics, and that is that they despise authority. And we'll talk a little more about that when we get there. Now, when we started in verse 4, we brought some weird things up because Peter gets weird really quick, and he's going to do that again in verse 10, talking about these angelic authorities, and we'll talk more about that when we get there. But all this is to say, this one sentence that just builds and builds and builds and builds, all of this is to say that God does not tolerate sin. God does not allow sin. And even though it may seem like everything is going right now, even though it may seem like you can enjoy all the sinful things now, God does not tolerate it. But what God does do, though He doesn't tolerate sin, is He protects the righteous. He saves the righteous. Okay, so let's look here at verse 6. If he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes. Now this is interesting because a lot of times in our modern culture, our modern context, when we think about Sodom and Gomorrah, we don't think about them being reduced to ashes. We may think about the people dying. We may think about the cities being given to ruin. But you know, a lot of people, when they think about Sodom and Gomorrah or a destroyed city, they still see structures standing in ruin, albeit standing. Well, that's not what this says. It says it was destroyed to ash. And I think Jude, and I believe, I may have written this down, maybe not. Jude verses 7 and 8, I believe, are the verses. Maybe it's just 8, maybe it's just verse 7. Y'all can look and you can let me know. Refer to Sodom and Gomorrah as a picture of what hell is going to be like. That they were destroyed with fire. And they were destroyed to ash, having made them complete examples to those who live ungodly lives thereafter. The problem is, people no longer looked at Sodom and Gomorrah as the example. Now, you go back and read the Old Testament, Sodom and Gomorrah was the example, right? We don't want a Sodom and Gomorrah again. I said earlier that this verse, or this series of verses, this sentence, is written in a parallel construction. I don't know if Peter meant to do that. Peter, if we take him as he is, as a fisherman from Galilee, is probably not the greatest poet in the world. So if this is an accidental happenstance, fine. If he meant to do it, fine. But you can see how the angels, when they sinned, the ancient world, and Sodom and Gomorrah are all paralleled, and then you have Noah and Lot that are also paralleled as the righteous. And so what you have is a type and an antitype. The type being the unrighteous, the antitype being the righteous. And you see how those all go together. I think it is interesting that when you talk about the angels, when you talk about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, both of those are destroyed with fire. The angels were cast into hell. And if you take the position, and I don't know that I do, okay? I think it makes sense. I don't know that it matters one way or the other. If you take the position that the ancient world that is referred to here is not another thing to be destroyed, but is the product of the angels and the unrighteousness of the angels marrying and having children with human women and all of that stuff, the Nephilim of Genesis chapter 6 and all of that stuff. If you take that as one story, then fire still encompasses that, though the flood certainly would be the destroyer of the natural world. Sodom and Gomorrah then, reduced to ashes, they're the example. And we'll talk more about Sodom and Gomorrah here when we talk about Lot. When we come to verse 7, y'all, Paul does this too. I don't want to just pick on Peter, but Peter lays it on thick here with Lot. Lot is not the righteous man that Peter portrays here, especially if you read Genesis 18 and 19 and those accounts of Lot breaking away from Abraham, going to Sodom and Gomorrah and living his life there. But what Peter is doing, if we take the parallel approach, he's trying to liken Lot to Noah. Why was Noah saved? Noah was saved for two reasons. Number one, he found favor in the eyes of God. He was a righteous man. And number two, God told him what to do, and he did it. Okay, those are the two things that saved Noah. Lot, then, if he's using this parallel construction, Lot has to be the righteous in the story. Now, when you go back and you think about Sodom and Gomorrah, those are the cities that had no righteousness at all, right? Abraham bargains with God, which should not shock us. I know we read the Pentateuch and we see these bargaining dissertations and dialogues between insert man here and God, Moses and God, Abraham and God, and we say, well, how dare they bargain with God? Well, this is not at all racial profiling or anything like that, but you go over to the Middle East and you look at the cultures over there, they are a bargaining culture. That came all the way back to the culture of Abraham, and it just stuck. That's the way people are over there, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's not to say that you want to outdo God or that you want to trick God to get the deal, if you will. It's just the way that they would have talked to God. Okay, nothing wrong with that. So Abraham bargains with God. If there's just X amount of righteous people, then surely you won't destroy the whole city. Well, guess what? There wasn't. The only righteous person that could be found was Lot. And so God saves Lot and destroys the city. If he rescued righteous Lot, the word righteous is used in reference to Lot 3 times here. Righteous Lot, righteous man, and righteous soul. Now, Lot had some good qualities about him. You know, when the angels came to visit him and the men were trying to break in, he did everything he could to protect them and protect himself against that. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But Lot was the one who left Abraham, right? Abraham didn't go up to Lot and say, okay, Lot, my men and your men are having a dispute, so you need to go. No, Lot did that. Lot came up to Abraham and said, the only way we're going to get along is if we depart. Then Abraham gave Lot the choice. Well, which way do you want to go? Because whichever way you're going, I'll just go the other way. You have your pick of whatever you want. And guess what Lot took? Lot was a spoiled brat because Lot took the best, right? Lot took the greener pastures. Why is it that Lot wanted to leave Abraham? Because the grass looked greener on the other side. And when he got to the grass on the other side, it was great for a little while. When we leave Lot in Genesis 18, I believe it is, we find him, the Bible says, with his tent pitched toward Sodom. He's not in Sodom, but he's headed that direction. The next time we see Lot, his tent isn't pitched toward Sodom. He's not even on the border of Sodom. He is within Sodom. exegetical preacher moment here for just a second. You pitch your tent towards something, you're going to wind up there eventually. That can be both good and bad. And so that's what Lot does. We find him the next time in Sodom. Not only do we find him in Sodom, but we find him as a person who is known in Sodom, which means that he had to do something to get up the ranks. I'm guessing probably because of his wealth, because when he broke off from Abraham, he was the height of his family, so that may have had something to do with it. He rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men. I want to talk a little bit about the unsensual conduct here, or the sensual conduct. There is a new biblical criticism, and when we say criticism, we're not saying that we're criticizing the Bible. We're talking about different ways in which we can read and interpret the Bible. What we're doing now is biblical criticism. We're looking at this from a historical context. And that's what I like to do a lot of times whenever I teach and preach, because I firmly believe that the only way you can get to the root of the message is to see that historical context in which it was written. There is a biblical criticism now that's very popular, and it's called queer criticism. And what this does is it attempts to read the Bible through the perspective of the LGBTQ plus whatever they keep adding to it. I can never keep up with it. That culture, and to say God never was anti-gay, that God never cared who loved or who married each other or whatever. And the first place they go is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, because those who are against homosexuality, that's the first place they go, is to Sodom and Gomorrah. What they would say is that the sin that happened in the story of Lot was that the men wanted to rape Lot and the angels and all of that. There may be an amount of truth to that rape may have been in that. The way I read the text, and again, the way I read the text, if the men wanted to get a hold of him, if they were going to rape him, they would have found a way. But if you interpret that passage as a rape passage, then you have to read this passage differently, because we're talking about, as Peter says, the sensual conduct. Sensual. Following after the lust of the flesh. I think it should further be noted that the men were not satisfied with Lot's proposition of take my daughters. It's not that they wanted to fulfill their sexual desires. They wanted a homosexual relationship or a homosexual sexual encounter at that point. Now, it's also been argued that the sin of Sodom goes far beyond homosexuality. That, I will tell you, is true. The sin of Sodom goes far beyond homosexuality. You can read extra biblical sources that talk about Sodom and Gomorrah and the violence that went on in Sodom and Gomorrah. You could be killed or beaten or strung up or tortured for literally anything. It's a very violent place. So, when it comes up to the topic of homosexuality, does Sodom and Gomorrah address homosexuality? Absolutely, because it deals with the sensual conduct of unprincipled men. Nothing to do with rape or not, but... And notice what it says in verse 8, for by what he saw and heard, that righteous man, there's again that word righteous applied to Lot, while living among them, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day by their lawless deeds. Now again, I've said it once, I'll say it again, Peter lays it on thick here, because let me tell you, if you feel your soul being torn apart by unrighteousness, you ought to have the common sense as a Christian or a God follower to get out of that situation. And Lot didn't. It literally took angels of God coming to him and saying, you have a choice. Either get out or die. So, Peter, I understand what you're doing, trying to make the parallel here but you're not fooling anybody because hindsight's 20/20, and guess what? We have the account of Lot, and we can kind of see. I'm not saying this isn't inspired. I'm just saying that Peter in his inspiration lays it on thick. Paul does the same thing. Go back and read the letter to Philippians and tell me Paul doesn't lay it on thick. The church at Philippi had sponsored Paul. They had quit sponsoring him, and Paul is basically writing the letter of Philippians to be a missionary letter to say, give me more money. And anyways, verse 9 then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation and keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment, especially those who indulge in the flesh and its corrupt desires and despise authority. Now, that's the whole message of this sentence. God knows, God has the ability how to rescue the godly from temptation. Paul tells us that when we are tempted, God does make a way for escape. What Paul doesn't say is that you have to be smart enough and have the common sense enough and the faith enough to take it. And I've been tempted many times and haven't taken the way of escape. I'm ashamed to say. But God provided it. To keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment. This is an interesting verse. I don't know that I have an interpretation or a meaning of it, because it implies then that punishment is happening now, and that will lead to a final judgment, and then punishment will happen after that final judgment that may be different from the punishment that's happening now. I don't know if that's what this passage is trying to say. I really don't. I have no idea. If you want to take that construction, I would suggest that you do so also taking Luke 16, I believe it is. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, about the rich man and Lazarus. Now, I would argue that the whole story of the rich man and Lazarus, which I take to be a true story, whether you do or not is fine. Just don't tell me it's a parable, because it's not. If it's not a true story, it's a narrative. It's never once a parable. But you have the picture of the righteous man, the Lazarus, going to paradise, and the unrighteous man, the rich man, going to a place of torment. That may well be what Peter is alluding to here, that there's a place of torment that is a holding place in Hades, separated by the gulf, that ultimately one day we're all going to be judged, and then from there we will receive either our reward or our punishment, heaven or hell. I don't know that he's alluding to that. He doesn't tell us. But that's why we read and study. Now, verse 10, especially those who indulge in the flesh, his corrupt desires and despise authority. Now, this indulging in the flesh, we're going to see later on in 2 Peter, that what these people are doing is that they are allowing themselves to practice these pagan rituals. They're allowing themselves to practice these lust of the flesh, if you will, that were popular and considered worship in the pagan world, while still claiming to be Christians. Now, this phrase, despise authority, is unique. Let me look here at my text. Literally, this means that they look down upon lordship. Okay, now, understand, when we think about lordship, we're not talking about Lord, capital L-O-R-D. We're talking about those who are in authority, places of prominence, things like that. But I don't like, and this is New American Standard, so people who get mad that I talk about King James mistranslation, you can get happy. I'm talking about my own version here. Despise, I don't like that we translate it as despise, because the literal sense of looking down upon means that you're not necessarily hating it, you're just seeing yourself above it. For you to look down on something, you have to place yourself above the thing which you look down, right? So these people, it's not that they hate the authority. That may be part of it, but they are placing themselves higher than the authority of Jesus. We need to be careful about that. Many times, Christians want to place themselves higher than the authority of Jesus. And I'll tell you a big way that the church does it. Not necessarily within ourselves, but we have placed the authority of Paul over the authority of Jesus. So many times we read Paul first and say, what did Jesus have to say about that? No, read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, then read Paul. Paul makes sense when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Jesus doesn't make sense when you read Paul first. Okay? So, there we have it. We need to be careful about how we look at authority then. All right, let's move on then to the second part of verse 10, because that stops. Again, chapter and verse divisions just drive me nuts. That verse 10, cuts the sentence in half. But yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah, so the question is, for those who weren't able to hear, the question is verse 4 there to perhaps help the Hellenistic people, those who have been transferred, if you will, into I'll go even beyond Hellenism, to say Greco-Roman, because Hellenism refers only to Greek, but Peter's writing at a time of where Rome is in control here. The answer is both yes and no. The reason for that is you brought up 1 Enoch. Verse 4 does refer to 1 Enoch. We read from 1 Enoch a little bit last week. 1 Enoch does by no means date back to the historical Enoch of Genesis. It does date back, however, to that gap of 400 years between Malachi and Matthew, which is where the rise of Hellenism was. So I think what is happening here in verse 4 is not to say that Peter is saying this is the story. I don't think Peter is saying this is what actually happened. If it did, fine. Again, don't miss the forest for the trees. What I think Peter does, and Jude is the world's worst about doing this, because Jude is going to quote from 1 Enoch and the Assumption of Moses, which are both apocryphal and pseudepigraphal works from that 400 years. But I think what Peter does here is he uses it as an illustration that God does not allow or tolerate sin. If Ron and I were to stand in the pulpit and we were to talk about the name of God, let's say we had a sermon on the name of God, and I started by quoting from Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare's play, what's in a name, or a rose by any other name would smell just as sweet, or whatever, and talk about the significance of a name. Does that mean that William Shakespeare was inspired when he wrote Romeo and Juliet? No. We're using it as an illustrative purpose. The same is true here, I think, that he's using. And Paul does this as well. He doesn't refer to Apocrypha, but Paul quotes from poets, from Greek poets and philosophers and things like that. So to answer your question, since I've kind of beat around the bush here for a few minutes, I don't think this is to help those who are Hellenistic, because Peter isn't writing to a Hellenistic congregation. He's writing to a predominantly Jewish congregation, Jewish context, that may have some Gentile converts in it. Maybe that answers your question. I don't know. Hopefully it does. Anybody else have any questions or comments? All right. And Ron, we will see a lot more of that First Enoch later on. And we're actually may even allude to it some here in verse 10, the last part of verse 10 through 13. So verse 10 says, and following, daring self-willed, they do not tremble when they revile angelic majesties, whereas angels who are greater in might and power do not bring a reviling judgment against them before the Lord. But these, like unreasoning animals born as creatures of instinct to be captured and killed, reviling where they have no knowledge, will in the destruction of those creatures also be destroyed, suffering wrong as the wages of doing wrong. And verse 13 continues, but we'll stop there for now. Starting in the second half of verse 10, the word daring here literally means boldly. I think daring is a fine translation, but that someone just has the audacity to do this. I think Peter writes this with some disgust, like he's writing these words and kind of throws up in his mouth a little bit. It makes him physically sick to think about someone who would be doing this. Like, how dare they? And for someone like Peter to do that, I think is significant, because Peter had his rough patches too. Self-willed, they do not tremble when they revile angelic majesties. So here, Ron, we go again about the angels. And what we see in verse 11 is an allusion, I think, to the Assumption of Moses that Jude brings out even more. later on, I think in verse 14 and 15. I may be very wrong about that, but somewhere later on in the last part of the book of Jude. This phrase, to revile angelic majesties, raises a lot of questions. Literally, the phrase would mean to speak against glory. The word blasphemy is used here. And to blaspheme just means to speak against. So to speak against glory, or it may refer to a glorious heavenly being. The Greek word that trips us up here in translation is the word doxos, which means glory, mostly. But if you look at how it's used in context, extra-biblical and biblical, sometimes it refers to God Himself. Sometimes it refers to a state of glory. Sometimes it refers to a glorious being. And then sometimes it refers to brightness. If we were to walk in a room and have a huge flash come on us of pure, bright, white light, we may say that that was a glorious thing. Okay? The glory of the light or something like that. That's where that comes from. So is this referring to angels? Well, I think here it is, based on verse 11. Verse 11, the word angelos is used, angel in Greek, and so you have the parallel there. Whereas angels who are greater in might and power do not bring a reviling judgment against them before the Lord. Now, who are we talking about? Who is the them? Okay, we're talking about false teachers. Don't forget our context. I know week by week we break our context up and there's no other way to get around that. But remember, the end of chapter 1, Peter talked about true prophets, those who were inspired by the Spirit, right? The message they received, inspired by the Spirit, they told what the message was, moved by the Spirit, there you go. Then chapter 2 begins talking about false prophets. That's what we've been talking about this entire time, the sin of false prophets. And then verse 4 through 10 kind of broke that up for us because Peter is going to just over-illustrate the point that he's made. And then we come back to talking about that. So who is the them? The them is the false prophets, these Gnostic teachers, these wolves in sheep's clothing. Angels who are greater in might and power do not bring a reviling judgment against them before the Lord. I think this refers to, I did write it down, it's Jude verses 8 and 9. Jude verses 8 and 9, not 7 and 8 or 14 and 15. I'm sorry. Been a while since I looked at Jude. Jude verses 8 and 9 talk about the Assumption of Moses. It is the story that we don't find anywhere else in our Bibles. But it's the story that Michael the archangel and Satan fought over the body of Moses when Moses died. Satan said he's a sinner. He was cast out of the promised land. His body is my property. Michael said he is a servant of God. He was a righteous man. His body is my property. And they fought. Again, that comes from the Assumption of Moses, apocryphal work. Clearly not seeing the severity or the importance of a soul. I think the ultimate message there is just simply that the second best in heaven is better than the first of hell. And by the way, archangel is not a over-powerful angel. Archos just means leader. So Michael is a leader of the angels. They're fighting over the body of Moses, and what you find at the end there is that Michael could have destroyed Satan right then and there. That's what Jude says. Michael had the power to just destroy Satan right then and there, but he didn't. Why? Because it was not Michael's place to pass judgment on Satan. Boy, we read Matthew chapter 7 differently now, don't we, about judge not lest ye be judged. If Michael couldn't pass judgment on Satan, how can I pass judgment on you or you on me? Michael said it is God's place to judge. Now, whether or not this story is true, I don't know. I don't really care. It certainly illustrates a great point. I think that's what we're alluding to here, that the angels who are greater in might and power, every time you see an angel in Scripture, it is always something to be afraid of. Always. There is no, I'm trying not to get into my sermon for Sunday night, but there is no such thing as a little floaty Valentine howdy-doody angel. No such thing. Most of the time, not every time, but most of the time when you see an angel, he is carrying a sword, he's ready for battle, and usually says, "Do not fear." Now tell me, why would an angel say, "Do not fear," if I wasn't afraid? When Gabriel comes to see Mary, the first words out of his mouth was, "Do not fear." And it wasn't "do not fear" about being pregnant, it was "do not fear that I'm an angel and usually I'm here to kill people." So the angels, they're greater in might and power, and we're not going to go into a study of angels or anything, but they have the power and might. These false prophets who are reviling against the authority, they're despising that glory, they say their place is with God. Their ultimate judgment is with God. And I think Peter's message here is that if their ultimate judgment is with God, you ought not worry about them. Kind of like what Peter says in 1 Peter about persecution. God's going to take care of it. You do you keep up with you, know the truth. Verse 12, "But these like unreasoning animals." Now, this phrase unreasoning animal, this is kind of interesting. The word unreasoning is the word alogia, which is the word logos, basically, with the prefix alpha, or our English letter A, which in Greek negates or says without what the root word is. Now, you know the word logos. Jesus is the logos. Logos means word, right? And I'm very wary about doing a word study on the word logos because it can be used so many different ways in so many different contexts. Logos refers to Jesus. The Word became flesh, John chapter 1. That's the word logos. Jesus is the logos of God. He is the Word of God. Unreasoning is the word logos with the prefix A in front of it. Alaga. Okay, not logia, alaga. Logos in Greek thought, not Roman thought, but in Greek thought, talking about the Hellenists again, get back when Alexander the Great was on his rise. The ultimate quest for a philosopher was to find logos, to find reason, to find meaning. That's what logos meant to a Greek in Alexandrian Hellenistic world. This is the opposite. Unreasoning. No meaning. That's what these animals are. Whether or not the term should be translated animals, I don't know. It's the term zoa, which just means living thing. I guess it's referring to animals here. Born as creatures of instinct to be captured and killed, reviling where they have no knowledge, which is funny because the Gnostics claim to have this secret knowledge, but Peter says they have no knowledge. Will in the destruction of those creatures also be destroyed. The way that they are like these unreasoning animals is that they let their passion and their flesh control what they do. You know, human beings, are the only living creature that has the ability to control their flesh. We are. No other living being has that ability. And then verse 13, suffering wrong as the wages of doing wrong. Remember what Peter said in 1 Peter. I kind of wonder if Peter's alluding back to this. Where Peter in chapter 2 says, if you suffer for doing righteousness, then good. That's good. If you suffer for doing wrong, you had it coming to you. You know, there's no glory, there's no honor in suffering for doing wrong. And I think that's what he's saying here. Suffering wrong is the wages of doing wrong. They'll get what's coming to them. Okay, we got about 2 minutes left. I want to stop here because verse 13, as it goes on, just keeps talking about this. We'll finish chapter 2 next week. Anybody have any questions or comments? I know sometimes I get on a roll and kind of forget that other people need to talk too. Well, either I did a really good job or a really bad job, but either way, I appreciate your participation, your attention, and as always, look forward to worshiping with you here in about 5 minutes or so. And if anybody does have a question or a comment, you can always ask or say or whatever.